Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about the two works that you had to discuss. Now, you only had to pick one of them, and then you had to play like detective to figure out and answer kind of that art criticism. Now, many students do an awesome job of being able to find the artwork and look at resources and get fun facts like the piece, the date, who it was created, the techniques used, and a little bit about the piece. But one thing that students lack is really diving into, well, what do we visually see? And how is it the same or different from other cultures? And then, two, what's the overall theme? Like, why would they want to depict what we're seeing in front of us? So, we're going to spend just a few minutes touching on a few of those things just to start training your eye on what to look for. So that way, as we continue with this course, you know and become an awesome art detective. Okay, so let's start with the boxers here on the left. So that is a Minoan artwork and it's a fresco. So hopefully you added into your artwork a little bit about the fresco technique. It is something that you're going to hear often, as that's some of the earliest forms of paintings. And what a fresco is they apply like a plaster onto the wall, and then while it's still wet, they add the color. Now, what's nice about this one, or Minoans in general, is that they use a technique called a fresco secco, in which case, when they applied the plaster, they put down their initial color. Let's think of it like a base color paint if you were to paint your bedroom wall. And then once the paint has dried, they added details, okay? And now those details might be the lovely blue colors that we see, or like details such as their cloths or their hair, or just like the little gold touches, but the base color would maybe be this kind of terracotta, orangey skin tone. Okay, so that's what they did there. All right, let's delve into this piece a little bit more. Okay, so the next thing you really need to think about is, identifying what it is we're looking at. So here we see two youth males. They look relatively young. We can be under the impression that they're youth males, and it looks like they're boxing. Obviously, that's in the title. So it's an activity that they're doing. Okay. Um, they both look to be about the same, okay, in the sense of there's not a lot of identification between the two. The only thing that we notice between the one on the left versus the one on the right is the one on the right has a little bit more jewelry or decoration. We can assume that because of status, sometimes those ornate decorations or jewelry made are very expensive. It's not for the common folk. And that goes across many cultures. Um, so we can have a pretty good idea that this person on the left might be of a royal or just more wealthy class, whereas the one on the right might be like a sparring partner, someone who could be a slave or servant or just lesser than who they're practicing with. Okay. Um, so that's one thing to do. So then once you identify what it is you're looking at, even if the characters, the figures are unknown, meaning we don't know exactly who these are, you have to think, well, what is the scene telling us? So going back to the theme page, that theme page was on page 2 of your lesson. It gave very common themes to art. And if you scroll through there, there's not one that really sticks out that goes, aha, that's the winner. But if you have to just like separate yourself of like, okay, we have two people, two youths fighting. That seems like an everyday occurrence. I had read that, in this culture, wrestling, boxing are popular sports that have been documented. So we can safely assume that this is just a depiction of that event. And it's maybe not like a big, like sparring match. Maybe it's just practice. And you're going to find that in art as we continue. Sometimes the art you're looking at doesn't fit in a nice little neat box of a theme, but as a larger thematic thing, you could write about how this is showing cultural life. It's just showing a little bit of the importance of things that are happening in that culture that were important to them. It's like daily activities that they're wanting to document. And we love that because that's how we really learn insight as to the day to day life. Okay. So that would be the theme for this piece. Okay. Let's look at the art a little bit closer. We notice that our figures, if we're just dissecting our figures are standing in a profile, but their bodies seem a little not proportionate. Like we got really long torsos, short little steppy legs. The way that they're standing doesn't look natural. And this would give an indication that we can understand what it is we're looking at. They're standing, facing each other. But at this point, either the artist did not find it important, or two, they just did not know how to visually show correct overlapping and how, if truthfully this foot or leg was standing behind, the foot would be raised up a little bit to show the illusion of depth. And that's tricky. And you're eventually going to find those awesome artworks and art movements when the artists go, aha, I know what I'm doing. But as of right now, they don't. So they're putting the length of the leg as equal on the equal same plane, which would realistically be incorrect. Okay. If we look at the head, though, or the sizes, the head looks okay. We get one eye with a profile. But as I kind of alluded to before, there's no identification here. You do not get a sense that this person is different from this one. And when I say in identity, we're talking about individuality, different nose shapes, different eye shapes, different hair, different body shapes. Us as humans have a lot of variety in that. And in this particular artwork, we're not seeing any of that. And that's an important piece to note, that although they're depicting a everyday event, they're not depicting like Joe. They're not depicting Sam, because those people don't exist. It wasn't important to show individuality. They're showing more of an action, okay? Um, if you also look, there's no other sense of space, no illusion, no decoration. It is just our two figures, and also it lacks depth in terms of values. Values are like the shading, light to dark. It makes something, instead of a sphere, or I'm sorry, instead of a circle, it looks like a sphere. So it makes it feel like a form, like the three dimensionality. Values are what do that. In this piece, we call it flat. It's completely flat. The color is flat. This becomes a shape. The body is a shape. It doesn't have a sense of thickness or three dimensionality to the legs. Okay, so let's scroll over and look at this one here, and let's look at the visual cues there. Here we have, hopefully you read about the Egyptians and how they use hieroglyphs and they use hierarchy. Hierarchy is like big to small, something important, something less important. And that was super important to the Egyptians. So while, the boxers here might be just showing everyday activity, the Egyptians have what's called a canon, and it's like a set rules. Like there was no artistic freedom. Every artist was more like a technician who had to follow the rules. And you have to think of it like picture books. Egyptians told stories through pictures. So you have to think, okay, if I was looking at a children's book, like an everyday children's book, we use simple shapes and treat them like symbols, like a flower, a sun. A sun is a circle with lines going around it. Anybody looking at that would recognize that as a sun, and I can understand the story. Egyptians were very similar. They were just wanting to depict a pictorial narrative, okay? And if we're looking at this, this is with King Namar. So this thematically probably had to do with a power, authority, or propaganda. It's about how he's, victorious as he defeats his enemies, and we can see that here. Now it's broken up with these lines. The lines segment it, and that is one maybe to help tell the parts of the stories, like part one of the story, part two of the story. But it also is because they did not know or care to show the illusion of depth, like realistic space, because you don't need realistic space to tell a story. You need like the symbols. So on this top part, I have my king, and I know it's my king, not because he's wearing some fancy crown, because he's large. So they use size to really indicate importance. So he's king and he's big and he's defeated all his lovely little enemies, and they're headless and they're in rows and rows to show that he's very victorious. and they're headless, okay? If we look at this middle section below it, we have these animals. So here they're breaking away from realism and getting more symbolic, okay, to represent maybe the unification of the kingdom. All right. Over here, he's triumphing on the right part where we see him very large. He's being kind of that sense of control and authority over his weaker counterparts. Okay. And if we look at their body, there's absolutely no facial expression, no sense of identity. Looking at this relief, we can't get a sense of what he looks like as a person because it's more of a symbol, right? And so, just like if we're trying to make comparisons, just like the boxers, there's no individuality seen in art yet at either of these stages. Okay. Um, if we also look, it's minimal detail. There's a lot of focus on line. Line is the only thing that separates various shapes or for us to understand. And that's same true with the boxer. So when we're talking about the art element and which one to include, this is line dominant. There's no space, okay? There's no illusion of depth. There's no textures. Textures is like, granted, you have like the crumbliness of the fresco or the smoothness of the mudstone and the palette, but there's no illusion of textures. There doesn't indicate skin texture versus like plant texture versus animal texture. There's none of that. Really, all you have is lines that define shape. And so it's very simplistic, but simple doesn't mean that they aren't aware of. They're choosing purposefully not to put it in, not because their artisans aren't skilled. They're very skilled. I mean, it's a set of rules, but you have to realize the purpose was to tell a pictorial story, to document it in the history of time so that future generations can read this and go, oh my gosh, that King Namar, he was a pretty awesome guy. Look how victorious he was. So you have to just realize um, that in order to do that, I think they did an efficient job of depicting the things that were important to the culture while minimizing or getting rid of the other aspects that aren't important. Okay. Let's also take a look. Very similarly, though, they don't show perspective either, where the body looks very rigid. It feels like a statue, it feels like a solid rock. At least, here it looks very mechanical with their body. That's something to point out because that's a characteristic of Egyptian with the profile feet, the twisted torso, profile head, but no facial expression. And you can even go, hey, yeah, that's kind of like the uh, Minoans over here with the profile feet, twisted torso, and the profile head. Yet this one has a much more sense of fluidity in the body movement, right? In fact, it looks like their little bellies are sticking out here, like their little guts. But and I don't think that was really the case, but there's a sense of a little bit of curvature here. The Egyptians were so rigid. I mean, I just want you to think like robot, like the knees don't bend. Okay. Try walking around with no knees bent. Um, and so you just have to recognize that those are key style characteristics that were seen as excellence and the way to do or make art during this time period. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else I want to add. But the other thing, I guess the most important is they're much more symbolic and the high, the hierarchy of big, medium, and small. Okay. So hopefully this gives you a little starting point and insight of how to dissect artworks and to really like look through it because art is wonderful. Like I love art in the sense that it has so many little clues for you and there's a lot of connections you can make, but you have to look for them. You have to really, really look for them in the tiny little spaces and just kind of see how are they showing the figure or how are they showing the objects in relative to not just the material they're using, but then what's that saying and why are they showing it this way? Okay, so just a helpful hints, include any of this information into your artwork because it shows me that you were starting to look like an artist. Okay, that's